One night, in the early 90s, me and my mate dropped some recreational psychedelics and went for a walk about the neighbourhood we'd grown up in. It was a suburb of a town that orbited West London, half council housing, half commuterville. Barring the Tudor church and pub, there weren't many visitor attractions, just the B-roads and mews we'd trudged up countless times. The parks, the playgrounds and the 24-hour garage, where we attempted to communicate our need for pot noodle to an underpaid, sleep-deprived human on the other side of a thick sheet of glass. We were not visited by some spirit quest vision. No day-glow chimeras rose up from sewer grates to chase us onto the M4 exit. The sodium streetlights buzzed with a bit more intensity and the halogen trails of passing cars lingered a little longer than usual. If anything, the old town was stripped even further of any subtle myths that we had built up since childhood. The place had never seemed so functional, boxy and mute. The stars above us were more visible than they would have been in Soho or Brixton, but the grounded lives they twinkled for were already shut in for the night. In the absence of any grand epiphanies or apocalyptic visions, it fell upon me to start plucking at the stitches of the everyday world. As me and my mate sat at a creaky old roundabout, I told him that our lives were actually an elaborate production, and everybody else that wasn't present in this moment was an actor. Our future partners and nemeses were rehearsing just beyond the periphery, waiting for their cues to step into our lives. I'd like to remind you that this was the early 90s, many years before the release of The Truman Show. I might have been many things in that evening, but a plagiarist wasn't one of them. When it was time to separate and head home at the designated midpoint between our houses, with sunrise a couple of hours away, I thought it would be funny to tell my mate that I was one of the actors too. As I turned around and walked off, I could hear him moaning to himself as I bit my cheeks to keep from laughing. If there is a moral to this story, I guess it's that what I lacked in physical prowess and courage in my late adolescence, I made up for in psychological sadism. The other moral, the one you've already guessed, is that it doesn't take much to convince someone that they are the narrative centre of existence. It is, after all, how we are plugged into the world. Welcome to my own bespoke gallery. I made it in Unity. It's the first and only thing I've created in Unity. I know I could have paid someone else to make this for me. I'm a tired, skint, middle-aged dad. Please cut me some slack. Anyway, as we begin our tour, I'd like to begin by looking at this pre-Renaissance banger. This is a section of a late Gothic altarpiece, The Adoration of the Magi, by Gentile da Fabriano. While there's a sense of perspective in the way that a long line of pilgrims is portrayed in the background, most of the figures in this image seem to be pressed flat into the same plane. The main distinction seems to be that the important figures, the Holy Family and the Magi and this casually intrusive cow, are given plenty of space to play out their scene, and the unimportant characters are crammed into the right hand side. I find the crowd on the right to be fascinating though. I mean, where is this guy in the red hat off to? The one turning away from the depressed leopard watching a pigeon fight. And then there's this leopard who seems to have a bit of a problem with these three horses laughing at this skinhead. And who exactly decides to bring leopards to a nativity anyway? Okay, I probably went for the wrong pre-Renaissance masterpiece to make the point that I'm about to make. I should have shown you this perspective free Last Supper painting instead. I see you, Judas, without a halo, without a halo, without a halo. But look at it. It's amazing. Look at baby Jesus proper spamming this dude right here. Anyway, back to the point I was making. If you were to ask who the most important person or persons were in this scene, you would probably say these people and the casually intrusive cow. The people, horses and leopards in the crowd on the right hand side are the bit parts, the peripheral characters. So let's move on to the Renaissance. Here's The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. Who is the most important person in this painting? Yes, I know your first instinct is to say Jesus because he's slap bang in the middle, but I have a very pretentious alternative answer. So, to make it seem a little bit less pretentious, I'll retell a joke I once saw on Twitter. Jesus and the 12 apostles walk into a restaurant and Jesus beckons the waiter. "Table for 26, please." The waiter replies, "But there's only 13 of you," and Jesus replies, We all like to sit on the same side. Again, we can look at this pre-Renaissance Last Supper here and give him credit for seating etiquette, but let's look at Da Vinci's Last Supper and ask the question, who is the most important person in this painting? Because there are 14 people in this painting. Jesus, the apostles, and the most important character, the viewer. It is the singular first-person point of view of the viewer themselves that determines the arrangement within this painting. From the one-point perspective that creates the sense of distance to the way in which the cast all sit facing the gaze of the viewer. The viewer doesn't really exist in pre-Renaissance art. In those works, the characters exist within a flat conceptual space that functions more like a map or inventory rather than a specific subjective experience. This video is about the first person point of view and how it creates a schism in how we view ourselves in relation to the world. In one sense, we are the centre of everything, plugged into a world in a way that makes it feel that we are the main point of focus, the very centre of things. At the other end of the scale is the fact that most of the world doesn't know or care about who we are and what we do. Everybody else is also having their own centred experience of the world about them. If one of them has a fleeting encounter with you, the impression that you made within their own subjective realm will probably fritter into nothingness within minutes. Now, the idea that we walk about with a constant feeling of being the centre of things in a world that does not recognise this grand claim is going to be the source of all kinds of dissonance and friction. When we get beyond the basic business of keeping our bodies sheltered and ticking over, we're left with an appetite for meaning, and for a lot of people, meaning is a case of narrowing that gap between how we see ourselves and how we appear to the world. One method could be creating a home. A corner of the world that really does centre us, where we might sit at the head of a table, where we are surrounded by framed photos of the special people and moments of our lives, a comfy chair and all the necessary conveniences within reach. Maybe a hobby too, a collection of porcelain hedgehogs or a bit of DIY carpentry, that kind of thing. When I think back to that suburb, where me and my mate tinkered with our brain chemistry, this boxed-in life was how most people existed. I was a blinkered, ambitious art student at the time, so I often dismissed the homely life as a kind of failure, a plebeian lack of ambition. Nowadays, as a middle-aged dad who is still dependent on a flaky and classist literary scene, the stable homely life seems like the better choice, but I get ahead of myself. Most people where I grew up were happy enough with this sense of belonging without needing much else, apart from the subset that ended up running a bit of a swingers club. But that was my lot, the Catholics. To make peace with the homely life, all you have to do is see your home as an extension of yourself and acknowledge that as soon as you step outside of it, these rules no longer apply. Having a home at least gives you the impression that there is a place where the sense of the importance of your existence stretches out a little further than the boundary of your skin. Maybe you can't find satisfaction with your home as an extended border between the feeling of being in the centre of everything and a wider world that barely recognises you. I'm not a driver, so I can only imagine how this feels when you're in a car, where you are in a portable version of your own little castle, but everyone else beyond it is moving about in their own little castle, and you are but a shadowed face behind a windscreen. Like the house option, you could shell out on a bigger car, like an upper middle class Londoner getting a 4x4 Range Rover for the school run and the weekly shop. And if a bigger car doesn't do it, then maybe you can buy a car that tells everyone how special you are, like a sports car with an eardrum-shattering engine or the overstated quietness of a Tesla. If a fancy car isn't an option, then maybe it's about being the hardest or funniest or sexiest person at your local boozer. Maybe it's about your front yard standing out from the others at Yuletide, your megawatt inflatable snowman display, something to demonstrate to a passerby with malfunctioning sat-nav that you are indeed the narrative centre of this particular cul-de-sac. One guy I often end up thinking about is a fella called Ronnie Pickering. Ronnie is now best known for a viral video of a road rage incident where he berates a moped driver from his car while his wife mutely morphs into the passenger seat. In the key point of the exchange, Ronnie Pickering says, "Do you know who I am?" followed by, "I'm Ronnie Pickering." And when the moped driver asks who Ronnie Pickering is, Ronnie Pickering says, "Me." Most people wouldn't have known who Ronnie Pickering was, but Ronnie Pickering seems obsessed by a strong conviction that everyone knows who he is, and that the very mention of his name would render the listener unto a state of terror. And I get it. There was a guy who everyone in the suburb I grew up in was scared of. He was big, intense, and all the local teens thought he was a hitman. If I'd been the object of that guy's ire, I would have been scared. I also feel a bit of empathy with Ronnie. His desolation on realising the disconnect between the local realm, where his name rings out like a clarion of doom, and the wider world, where the sound waves that carry the pronouncement of his name dissipate into indifferent silence, or in this case, laughter. It reminds me of when I fly into another country and all the billboards feature nationally famous TV and radio hosts, but I've only been there for a couple of hours, so they all just look like a random collection of aunties and uncles. There's always the border between the illusion that you're a big deal and the wider world that shrugs and asks, who? For most of us it goes as far as our four walls, but for some, it reaches out a bit wider. There's another image from TV that keeps popping into my head. It was an establishing shot that was used on American Idol, where all the auditionees were lined up in their hundreds outside the audition venue and shouted in unison, "I'm the next American Idol." I'm guessing the editor cut before they all looked at each other and replied in unison, "No, I am." Fame is perhaps the most extreme solution to this disconnect. To embark on the quest of convincing the rest of the world that you really are the centre of existence. I recently listened to an episode of the Blind Boy podcast where he spoke about Aesop's fable of the ass and the idol. An ass is carrying a religious idol to the church, and along the way, people are falling on their knees in worship. But while the people are worshipping the idol, the ass thinks that he is the object of worship. Then, when he's on the way back after delivering the idol, his master starts beating and whipping him, and the poor ass notices that all the people who fell on their knees in worship on the first leg are now pointing and laughing. He realises that it was never him that they were worshipping. They were always worshipping the idol. When I stopped being a blinkered, ambitious art student, I decided to become more pragmatic with the direction that I was taking in my life. Nah, of course I didn't. I decided to become a blinkered and ambitious poet instead. I couldn't quite shake the idea that an artsy life would save me from the drudgery of a normal life. My market research for the choice to become a fancy pants poet ignored all the data on poetry sales and the position of poetry in mainstream media and the national psyche. Instead, I chose to mine data from the field of my own half-baked and unexamined delusions. Despite all this, I got closer than most. I quit the day job for a national tour, international gigs, high-profile residencies, some TV appearances, hosting 2 events a week at London's only dedicated poetry venue. I even got a commendation from one of the big poetry prizes to show I wasn't just some garden variety performance poet. But there was never a feeling of having arrived. No matter how hard I tried to reach or contrive it, I never found myself in that special, non-ordinary place. And then it all started to fall away. Perhaps because of my own lack of professionalism and the constant arrival of brighter, younger talents to our tiny little scene. I was terrified. I went from not having enough to being consumed by the prospect of losing the little that I had. It was a slow, painful fall, with each little avenue of opportunity closing down one by one. And then, when a long enough time had elapsed since the last solicitation, I realised that it was done, and I was fine. In this instance, the fall was far worse than the landing. My side hustles of hosting, editing and teaching became my core hustles, and I could just about function as a house husband and stay-at-home dad with the rest of the time that I had. I want to move away from the fame and status thing and stick with the idea of playing a role. I once read about a streamer who played through Skyrim while pretending to be a non-player character, or NPC as they are commonly known. So instead of following the main chosen one quest line of a Dragonborn, they chose to play the game as a blacksmith. Instead of exploring the expansive map, they spent each day in the game making armour or weapons at the same spot, watching the inhabitants of a city go about their daily business. They'd say the odd hello between hammer strikes, go for a little stroll at the end of the working day, knock back a few horns of mead at the tavern, and finally hit the hay. This is something I love about open world video games. The main narrative is there for you, but you can always go off on a little detour while playing or just reject the whole main narrative altogether. During the lockdown phase of the 2020 pandemic, when all live gigs were effectively shut down and Zoom gigs felt like an awkward office party rather than the proper live event, I decided to attempt a spot of Twitch streaming. I was rereading a lot of a classic haiku by the itinerant masters such as Basho and Issa at the time. I was also playing lots of Red Dead Redemption 2. I realised that I could also go on this Twitch platform that all the cool kids were on and just explore the world of Red Dead while writing my own haiku. And that's what I did. I wandered about the crunchily crafted evocation of the last days of the Old West, looking for little details here and there while writing haiku about it. I don't think I ever exceeded a 1-digit live viewer count, and there were enough times when I had a viewer count of 0, and that was fine. It seemed to scratch the itch that remained after I was no longer able to run my weekly event. The problem was that I couldn't shake the awareness that I was a middle-aged man with my wife and kids in the next room, and I found it hard to justify shutting myself away from them to stream to almost nobody for a few hours a week. So after a few months, I stopped. But one thing I was able to do in my own gaming sessions was to stop for a moment and not be the character I was meant to be in the game. Forget about the story that held the thing together and take in the environment that the game had rendered before some random outlaw or grizzly bear popped up and yanked me back into the bloody narrative. At the same time, due to a few different practices that I was incorporating into my life, I was more able to see the stories that I was telling myself about the choices I made and the person I was. Stuff happened. Things came to be. But there was never a primal cause for any of it. So, on seeing personal stories like these for what they were, just thoughts happening in the here and now, I was able to cast them aside and remain as a wider state of consciousness, a stripped down feeling of presence. I could maintain this for a few extended moments before some random real-world event popped up and pulled me back in, just like the digital enemies that would pull me back into the narrative of those first-person video games. And that was just fine. I am a human being with responsibilities and dependents. It would not be a good thing if I was able to stand by a traffic light for an entire day letting the world buzz about me as I revelled in a state of pure being. But at the same time, I was able to remind myself that a lot of what I see as me with a capital M is just a big story, a mesh of narratives and subplots that could be dropped at any time, if only for a moment. In so many situations, that moment was enough. Another practice involved actively focusing on seeking out the location of the observer, the little geezer that maybe sits inside your head. A lot of Westerners experience this observer somewhere behind the eyes and between the ears, right where we think the brain is. I've also read that many people in cultures that are more communal and less individualistic experience the observer location in their chest, nearer their heart, and I bloody envy them for this. But for me, being a spiritually vacant Western materialist infidel, I often found myself locked inside my own head where my thoughts and inner monologues echo loudest. A little head within a bigger head. So, if we take a moment to look for that observer and locate it, then we find ourselves in the interesting situation of seeing that our awareness and the observer don't seem to be the same thing. If awareness is looking at the observer, then where is this awareness looking from? From my own experience, it's not so much that the observer and the awareness are separate, more that the sense of the observer is one of many things. thoughts, moods, sensations that exist within this wider state of awareness. It is a thought or an appearance that somehow mistakes itself for the center of all things. Another thing that I sometimes look for is the seam between the world that I observe and the sense of self that observes it. I can never find that seam. I can start from one and end up at the other, but there's never a sense of crossing a distinct boundary between the two. In the sense that the observer can be seen as fundamentally empty, we can follow from this back into the observed world and find it to be similarly empty. And this isn't the kind of emptiness we might talk about when describing something like feelings of depression, the feeling that something is missing in our lives. In Buddhism, for example, the concept of emptiness isn't necessarily the same as nothingness. It's more the idea that nothing exists in itself. All extant things are extant by the grace of the existence that surrounds and contains them. So, contrary to the philosophy of Kant and his noumenon, none of these things exist as a thing unto itself. Thinking back to that night in my old hometown, it's not that all those mute brick houses had stopped existing and that I wasn't in for a world of hurt if I ran headfirst into one of them. It was the narratives, the conceptual glue that seemed to hold it all together, that came unstuck. Everything was existing in the same way as it always had. I want to get back to Fabriano's Magi and its special place within my bespoke Unity gallery. Nobody in this painting is doing things the wrong way. Not the Holy Family, not the Magi, not the line of pilgrims, not the depressed leopards, not the boisterous horses, not the casually intrusive cow. In terms of the unity of the canvas itself, they are all playing their roles perfectly. Similarly, there is no right or wrong in how we experience our own stories and our own first personhood. It's liberating to stop playing the main narrative of a first-person video game, but that doesn't mean that the main story is worthless within itself. A big part of the fun of video games, or novels written in the first person for that matter, is the liberation of living in someone else's story for a while. I'm not anti-story. It's more that I am advocating for seeing all these stories as they are, especially the ones that you take to be your own. They all have their charms, and the only peril comes from identifying too closely with any of them. The failed poet, the doting father, the lazy husband, the compulsive gamer, the chirpy lecturer, the garrulous event host, the errant son, the face in the crowd, the enlightened sage, the spiritual bypasser, the weird white guy that passes the bus stop at the same time every day, the good Samaritan, the aloof bystander, the nobody, the man of the hour, the dearly departed. I have no idea which one I will be next, and I also acknowledge that I have no control over which narrative follows from the next on my life's playlist. But enough about me. Let me end this by zooming in to this dark surface, in the hope that you catch your own reflection in the glass of the device that you're watching on. If you can't see it, then change your position until there's something, maybe even a silhouette, that you recognize to be yourself. And once you recognize what you identify to be yourself, simply shift your focus onto that which made the recognition. Is that you too? If not, what is? What's your story?